In the stillness of an ordinary night, a lone figure moves through the shadows, calm, confident, and unnoticed. While somewhere across town, a person takes their final steps without realizing they just crossed paths with a predator hiding behind a perfectly ordinary smile. For years, he blended into everyday life, chatting with neighbors, holding doors open for strangers, showing up to work on time, and offering help when people least expected it. But behind that mask lives something far darker. A creature who studied faces the way a hunter studies prey, choosing victims with chilling precision and vanishing before anyone could connect the dots. Tonight, we peel back the layers of his deception, tracing the path of a serial predator who built his life on lies, manipulation, and the silent terror he left behind. This is the story of how he walked among us unseen, underestimated, and unchallenged until one mistake exposed the monster behind the mask. Welcome to Faces of Evil, unmasking a serial predator. It began the way these stories often do, quietly, subtly, hidden beneath the noise of everyday life. At first, the disappearances seemed isolated, tragedies with no common thread, the kind of painful mysteries small communities try to rationalize. A college student who never made it home after a late shift. A woman whose morning jog suddenly veered into silence. A young man who stepped outside to take a phone call and vanished into the night. Each case held its own heartbreak, its own unanswered questions, its own theories whispered in living rooms and posted on community boards. But none of them, not even the investigators assigned to the cases, realized these were the first footprints of something far more sinister, a predator sharpening his craft, learning how to strike and slip away without a trace. Police struggled to build connections. The victims didn't share backgrounds, lifestyles, or routines. There was no clear motive, no pattern anyone could confidently point to. And in those early days, law enforcement treated each disappearance like its own isolated tragedy, rather than the work of a single, calculating mind. Families pleaded for help, posting flyers, organizing search parties, begging the media to keep their loved ones from fading into forgotten headlines. But as days turned to weeks, the fear began to simmer beneath the surface. Someone was hunting, and the community was too blind to see it. Behind the scenes, the predator watched the chaos unfold with chilling satisfaction. He studied the reactions, the news coverage, the panic. Every detail taught him something new: how the police responded, how long it took for searches to begin, which neighborhoods stirred faster than others, and which victims' families pushed harder for answers. Each missing person wasn't just a crime. It was a test. And with every successful escape, he learned to refine his methods, perfecting the dark craft he would soon unleash on a much larger scale. The first signs of danger were always there, but no one understood they were staring into the opening chapter of a much darker story. A story written by a man who was just beginning to reveal the shadow he carried inside. To most people, he looked perfectly ordinary, almost forgettable. A man who blended into the background so seamlessly that neighbors barely remembered what apartment he lived in. Coworkers rarely recalled what he said in meetings, and store clerks couldn't describe him even moments after he'd checked out. He cultivated this invisibility with precision. He learned early that monsters aren't born in darkness. They rebuilt by mastering the art of appearing harmless in the light. He held a steady job, though never anything that required too many questions or too much responsibility. He volunteered occasionally, donated small amounts of money to local causes, and offered help when someone struggled with groceries or needed a hand with their car. He wasn't friendly, but he was polite. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't cold either. He existed in that safe, unremarkable middle space where suspicion rarely lingers. People trust the predictable, the routine, the quiet ones who never make waves, and he understood this better than anyone. Behind closed doors, however, he lived an entirely different life. His apartment was meticulously organized, not out of cleanliness, but out of control. He kept trophies, small, seemingly meaningless objects taken from his victims, each one carefully labeled and hidden in places only he knew. To him, they weren't objects. They were reminders of power, symbols of the moments when he felt truly alive. He studied his victims long before he chose them. He memorized their routines, tracked their habits, watched how they moved through the world. To him, they were characters in a story he authored, each one selected for reasons only he understood. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his darkness, it was his talent for disguise. He wore masks that fit whatever situation demanded. The helpful neighbor, the quiet coworker, the polite stranger. He wasn't a shadow lurking in alleys. He was the man holding the door open for you, the one nodding kindly as you passed him on the street. Evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a smile. And while the community carried on unaware, he watched them all, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the next face to study, the next life to claim. Every serial predator has a pattern, even if it isn't obvious at first. And in this case, the victim seemed random until investigators began peeling back the layers. Each person came from a different walk of life: a student, a teacher, a construction worker, a nurse. But beneath the surface, subtle parallels emerged. They were empathetic, trusting, and often alone in moments when they crossed his path. People who didn't expect danger because they lived their lives trying to see the good in others. He chose victims who moved through predictable routines, not because they were weak, but because they were accessible. A student who studied late at the library, walking home through quiet streets lit only by distant street lamps. A woman who took the same jogging route every morning before sunrise. A man whose shift ended at the same time each night, always parking in the same dimly lit corner of the lot. To the world, these routines were ordinary. To him, they were invitations. The predator didn't rush. He didn't strike without study. He watched for days, sometimes weeks, learning the rhythms of their days and the gaps in their safety. He observed who lived alone, who didn't lock their doors until late at night, who trusted strangers enough to stop and answer a question. And once he understood the pattern, he inserted himself into their routines with calculated ease, passing by at the right moment, appearing lost, or simply blending into the environment until the timing was perfect. Families would later describe the same heartbreak. They were so kind. They always helped others. They trusted people too easily. These weren't flaws, they were the qualities that made them human. But to the predator, kindness was a vulnerability, trust was a weakness, and routine was a roadmap. The parallels among the victims weren't just behavioral, they were emotional. They were people the world should have protected, people who deserved far more than the fate they met. And as the list began to grow, investigators realized they weren't just dealing with disappearances. They were dealing with a predator who knew exactly what he was looking for. By the time investigators recognized the pattern, the crime scenes had already begun to paint a chilling portrait of the predator's methods. Each location, whether a wooded trail, an abandoned construction site, or a hidden stretch of riverbank, seemed carefully chosen, not for convenience, but for symbolism. He left just enough behind to taunt, never enough to convict. Every inch of ground felt rehearsed, like he had walked it over and over in his mind before ever taking a victim there. There were no obvious signs of struggle at most sites, suggesting the victims were caught off guard or incapacitated quickly. But what unsettled investigators most were the small, deliberate anomalies. A shoe placed neatly beside a tree, as if someone had intentionally set it down. A personal item missing from one scene, only to reappear days later miles away. Patterns that felt too precise to be coincidence and too purposeful to be accidents. Forensic teams scoured each location for clues. Tire tracks, footprints, fibers, broken twigs, disturbed soil. Yet the predator was relentlessly careful. He avoided leaving fingerprints, avoided dragging bodies, avoided paths with cameras or heavy foot traffic. He operated in the quiet spaces most people never think twice about, the forgotten corners where shadows fall just a little deeper. One crime scene, in particular, unnerved detectives. A clearing deep in the woods, hidden from every nearby trail, where faint markings in the dirt suggested someone had been bound, but the ropes were missing. So were the footprints leading out, as though he had deliberately swept the ground or used a method investigators couldn't identify. It was the first time authorities publicly admitted they were likely hunting someone who understood forensic science, or at least understood how to evade it. But the true horror of the crime scenes wasn't what was found. It was what wasn't. No struggle, no witnesses, no mistakes. The predator didn't just commit crimes, he curated them. Each site was a silent message, a signature left in absence rather than presence. And investigators knew that understanding these scenes was the key to stopping him before he chose the next place to leave his mark. As the cases mounted, the investigative teams faced a nightmare of complexity. Multiple jurisdictions, overlapping timelines, inconsistent early reports, and a predator who changed tactics just enough to confuse behavioral analysts. Detectives from neighboring regions met at crowded conference tables, pinning photos, maps, and notes, trying to find a common thread that refused to reveal itself. Pressure mounted quickly. Media outlets began connecting the dots before law enforcement officially could. Headlines warned of a possible serial predator, and public fear surged. Every lead became urgent, every tip a potential breakthrough. But with urgency came chaos. False sightings, rumors, and panicked calls overwhelmed the dispatch centers. Detectives worked around the clock, surviving on little sleep, chasing clues that often spiraled into dead ends. Some officers believed they were dealing with someone highly organized, methodical, intelligent. Others argued the killer relied on luck and opportunity. These disagreements led to tension, draining time they didn't have. Meanwhile, families of victims pleaded for action, showing up at police stations demanding answers, begging investigators not to let their loved ones become cold cases. Technological challenges added to the struggle. The predator avoided cameras, cell towers, and anything traceable. He moved like someone who understood both old-school techniques and modern surveillance limitations. Digital forensics found nothing. Behavioral analysts struggled to profile someone who left so few emotional footprints. And every day that passed increased the likelihood he would strike again. The turning point came when investigators began treating the predator not as a ghost, but as a man who used the predictability of the system against them. They realized he exploited slow interdepartmental communication, targeted areas with low police presence, and adapted quickly when authorities changed their approach. The race was no longer just about solving past crimes. It was about preventing the next one. And with every hour slipping by, investigators knew one truth with chilling certainty. If they didn't catch him soon, more lives would vanish into the darkness he had mastered. The case shifted on a night that seemed destined to be just another dead end. A patrol officer, responding to reports of suspicious activity near an abandoned industrial site, spotted a vehicle parked in an area no one had any reason to be. At first glance, it looked empty, but the officer's instinct said otherwise. Inside, partially hidden beneath the back seat, he found something investigators had never managed to recover before. An item belonging to one of the victims, an item the predator had kept as a trophy. For the first time, there was physical evidence linking multiple cases. Word spread through the task force in minutes. Detectives who had been drowning in uncertainty felt a surge of adrenaline. They combed through the car inch by inch, and though the predator had been meticulous, he had made one mistake. He left behind a partial fingerprint on a piece of plastic molding near the trunk. It wasn't enough for an immediate match, but it was enough to narrow the search. Simultaneously, a new witness came forward, someone who had seen a man in the area days earlier, acting strangely, watching a woman who had recently gone missing. Her description was vague, but it aligned with the direction investigators were now heading. The turning point wasn't just the evidence, it was the momentum. For the first time, the predator wasn't in complete control. Investigators began connecting old tips, revisiting dismissed leads, and reanalyzing footage from security cameras in nearby towns. A broader picture finally emerged, a pattern of movements, purchases, vehicle sightings, and timing that began pointing toward a single individual. Someone who had lived among them for years. Someone who had walked their streets unseen. Someone whose name was about to emerge from the shadows for the very first time. The predator was no longer a faceless ghost. He was becoming visible, and that visibility would be his undoing. Once investigators had a name, everything changed. Suddenly, all the fragments, the partial print, the sightings, the trophies, aligned around the same figure. A man who had never been arrested, never raised suspicion, never appeared in any criminal database. His records were clean, his background ordinary, almost painfully so. Yet the deeper investigators dug, the more cracks appeared in the facade he had spent years constructing. His aliases were the first sign. He had used different names for rentals, online purchases, and temporary jobs. Not illegal, just unusual enough to hint at a man who didn't want to be easily tracked. He had moved home several times in short periods, each move coinciding suspiciously with a disappearance. His digital footprint was minimal, nearly non-existent, as if he had intentionally erased it over time. Friends and coworkers described him as quiet, private, hard to read. No one recalled him having close relationships. Neighbors saw him leaving at odd hours, carrying duffel bags, sometimes parking his car blocks away for reasons no one understood. Yet none of it had ever seemed alarming until now. A search warrant revealed the truth. Hidden compartments inside his home held the items he had collected from victims over the years. Not just objects, memories, trophies, pieces of lives stolen too soon. Investigators found journals filled with cryptic notes, surveillance sketches, and timelines. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the evidence. It was the realization that he had documented them not as people, but as subjects, stripping them of humanity, even in death. The unmasking of the predator wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, horrifying revelation that the man they had passed on the street, the man who had smiled politely at the grocery store, had been playing a long, elaborate game of deception. His face was one they had seen 1,000 times without ever truly seeing it. A face crafted to hide the darkness beneath. And now, at last, the mask had fallen. With overwhelming evidence building and the predator's identity confirmed, investigators moved swiftly. They knew he was unpredictable, and they feared that once he sensed the walls closing in, he might strike again or disappear entirely. A surveillance team was assigned to track his movements, documenting every step he took. For 2 days, he behaved normally, going to work, shopping for groceries, driving familiar routes. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. He abruptly packed his belongings into his car, left his job mid-shift, and drove toward the outskirts of the city. Investigators recognized the pattern instantly. This was what he did before previous disappearances. He isolated himself, prepared, and waited for the right moment. They couldn't afford to let him reach that moment again. Covert vehicles followed him along rural roads, watching as he made turns with no clear destination, almost as if he suspected someone was behind him. In a chilling twist, he pulled into the parking lot of a remote hiking trail one, suspiciously close to a past crime scene. That was enough. SWAT teams moved in, surrounding the area before he could step into the forest. He attempted to flee, sprinting toward the trees with a speed fueled by desperation. But within seconds, armed officers closed in. A brief struggle followed, violent, frantic, primal. This was a man who had controlled the narrative for years, suddenly facing the one thing he never prepared for: the end. When they finally restrained him, he didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't beg. He simply smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a ripple of dread through every officer present. For the first time, the predator had been pulled from the shadows and forced into the light. And as he was placed in the back of a patrol car, handcuffs cutting into his wrists, investigators knew one truth. The world would never forget the night he was finally caught. Once in custody, psychologists, profilers, and forensic psychiatrists began the difficult process of unraveling the mind behind the crimes. But what they found wasn't a chaotic monster driven by rage or impulse. It was something far more chilling. He was calm, articulate, intelligent, and disturbingly self-aware. He did not deny his crimes, yet he did not confess them either. Instead, he spoke in detached, almost academic terms, as if analyzing someone else's behavior. Experts quickly realized they weren't dealing with someone driven by a single traumatic event or mental illness. This predator was methodical, a classic organized offender who planned every detail with surgical precision. He saw people as puzzles, challenges, opportunities to exert absolute control. The act itself wasn't about violence, it was about dominance. The feeling of power that lit up his mind in ways everyday life never could. What disturbed analysts most was his lack of remorse. When asked about his victims, he didn't refer to them by name, only by their roles in his process. The watcher, the inconsistent one, the compliant one. Each label reflected how he categorized people, stripping away their humanity and reducing them to variables in his psychological game. His journals revealed years of internal fantasies, each escalating in complexity. He wrote about the thrill of planning, the psychology of manipulation, and the art of becoming invisible in society. He didn't select victims because of who they were. He selected them because they were accessible, predictable, or simply because they crossed his path at the wrong moment. Investigators had hoped for answers, for insight into why he committed these crimes, what drove him, what shaped him. But instead, they were met with emptiness. He didn't offer closure. He didn't offer regret. He offered only a haunting reality. Sometimes evil has no origin story, no trauma, no motive. Sometimes it simply exists wearing the face of an ordinary man. The predator's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Streets once filled with tension now overflowed with grief, relief, and painful clarity. Families finally had answers, but answers didn't heal the wounds left behind. Candlelight vigils were held for the victims, and for weeks afterward, crowds gathered at memorial sites, leaving flowers, photos, and handwritten notes filled with both sorrow and strength. Survivors and families stepped forward with stories that reshaped the narrative. Their voices became the heart of the aftermath, their memories transforming from whispers of fear into declarations of resilience. Parents spoke about children taken too soon. Siblings shared the last conversations they ever had, and friends described the type of light each victim brought into the world. Law enforcement agencies, shaken by the case's complexity, began reorganizing protocols for handling missing person reports, cross-jurisdiction communication, and early warning signs of predatory behavior. Training seminars used this case as a blueprint for understanding hidden serial offenders, those who don't seek chaos or fame, but silence and invisibility. The community also changed. Neighborhoods formed safety coalitions, installed street cameras, improved lighting, and organized self-defense workshops. People who once moved through life, assuming danger, looked like shadows or strangers, now understood the truth. Sometimes it looks like the person next door. But the most powerful part of the aftermath came from the survivors themselves. Their testimonies didn't focus on the darkness of what happened, but on the lives of the loved ones lost. They refused to let the predator define the story. Instead, they reclaimed it, turning tragedy into advocacy, pushing for reforms, supporting other families of missing persons, and ensuring that the victims were remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. The case was over. The predator was behind bars. But the echoes of what happened would linger for years, because evil leaves scars. But so does courage. And in the end, it was the voices of the survivors, not the predator, that shaped the legacy of this story. In the end, the capture of the serial predator didn't bring back the lives he stole, nor did it erase the fear he carved into the hearts of entire communities. But it did something equally important. It tore away the mask he had hidden behind for years and exposed the truth that evil can exist in the most ordinary places, wearing the most unsuspecting faces. As the courtroom doors closed and the predator was finally silenced behind bars, the voices that rose above the darkness were not his, they were the voices of survivors, of families, of investigators who refused to give up. Their courage, their persistence, and their refusal to be forgotten transformed this tragic story into a warning, a reminder, and ultimately a testament to resilience. Evil may walk among us, silent and unseen, but so does strength. And as long as the world remembers the faces of those who were lost, and the lessons carved from their stories, no predator, no matter how skilled, how hidden, or how monstrous, can escape the light forever.